Switching over to Capitol Hill now, Senate leaders say that they are backing a breakthrough plan to control immigration at the southern border. It's part of a broader national security bill that took months to work out, but is already strongly opposed by many House Republicans and some Democrats. Nikole Killion has more.
A bipartisan trio of senators unveiled their final product Sunday in the form of a $118 billion national security package.
These are powerful new tools that allow any administration, this one and future administrations, to actually gain control of the border.
The compromise would give the administration new emergency authority to temporarily shut down the border, allowing immediate deportation before asylum is requested. The government would be required to close the border when migrant encounters reach a daily average of 5,000 over a week. It also ends catch-and-release policies and streamlines asylum cases by processing claims in 6 months or less.
There are Democrats willing to change the asylum law to make it better, to deal with parole, to enhance expedited removal.
In exchange, the bulk of the bill includes more aid to Ukraine, Israel, humanitarian assistance for Gaza and other conflict zones, and support for partners in the Indo-Pacific. But as soon as it was released, House GOP leaders struck it down, with Speaker Mike Johnson warning this bill is even worse than we expected. It will be dead on arrival. Instead, Johnson told members the House will vote this week on a standalone package to fund Israel, and he denied taking orders from former President Trump, who opposes the border deal.
He's not calling the shots. I am calling the shots for the House. That's our responsibility.
President Biden urged House Republicans not to play politics and said doing nothing is not an option. But some progressive Democrats and members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus are also expressing objections, claiming that they were left out of the border talks. Still, a test vote is set for this Wednesday in the Senate. Back to you.
Listen, Nikole, I want to go back to Speaker Johnson saying that, this is dead in the water before he even actually had a chance to read the verbiage of the bill. This addresses the problem. There's a crisis at the border. It gives, the president the power to shut down the border if he needs to. And it also addresses the need for funding for Israel, for Ukraine. What is it that the speaker opposes so much to this bill?
Well, look, it's a couple of things. I mean, obviously, his main point of contention is that House Republicans passed a border security package 9 months ago, and the Senate never took it up. And it goes even farther than this compromise. So that is really what he would like to see, what some other House and even some Senate Republicans would like to see. But the bottom line is that package is pretty much a non-starter in the Senate. So that is kind of what sparked some of these compromise talks. The other part of it is that the speaker wasn't really a part of these negotiations. And while he says that he has had a line into some of the senators who were involved and has been getting calls on this, he says that he really wasn't a part of this. So to a certain extent, that plays into his decision to oppose this and say that it's dead on arrival is certainly possible. But the bottom line is that many House Republicans simply think this bill doesn't go far enough.
So we know it's going nowhere in the House, but out of curiosity, does it have the votes in the Senate?
Well, that is going to be key, and I think it's important to point out that it's not just some Republicans who are opposed. As I mentioned, you have some progressive Democrats as well who oppose this package. Senator Bernie Sanders, of course, an independent, has said that he doesn't want to provide more funding for Israel or has expressed concerns about the way Israel is handling its war with Hamas. So that is a concern he has with this package. You also have, as I mentioned, some members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, like Senators Menendez and Padilla, who claim that they were not included in this process and that, this bill really shortchanges a lot of immigrant families. It doesn't really do much in terms of relieving some of the pressure at the border. And again, it goes too far in the sense that some of these policies are too stringent. So that is their concern. So it really is this delicate balancing act. And of course, I talked to a Republican negotiator in this process who also worries that because of the House Republican opposition, that maybe some Senate Republicans may now back off of this bill. So he wasn't sure if the votes would be there ultimately if this comes to a final vote on the floor, but we'll have to wait and see.
We will. Nikole, thank you.
You bet.
Well, more than a dozen Republican governors are showing their support for efforts in Texas to secure the southern border. They joined Governor Greg Abbott in Eagle Pass yesterday. He claims the Biden administration's refusal to enforce U.S. immigration laws has forced his hand. But Abbott has taken some extreme measures to counter the rising number of migrant crossings into his state. CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez is joining us now with a little bit more on the latest. Camilo, always good to see you. What else did Governor Abbott have to say?
Good morning, Emery. Texas Governor Greg Abbott is doubling down on his actions here at the U.S. Mexico border, and his move to fortify a park in Eagle Pass has been now supported by more than a dozen Republican governors who joined him there yesterday on Sunday. He said that he will continue to fortify that area with razor wire and other barriers to impede the passage of migrants, saying that every state has a right to defend itself from an invasion. That is the term, Anne-Marie, that he has used to describe the situation here along the U.S. Mexico border. Obviously, it is important to underscore that while illegal crossings here have reached record levels over the past 3 years, there is no military offensive here, and most of the migrants here are not serious criminals, and they're definitely not armed. Some of them are families with children, Anne-Marie, as you know. But his actions there are garnering controversy in Washington, D.C. as well. The Department of Homeland Security is demanding that Abbott and the Texas National Guard allow Border Patrol back into this area known as Shelby Park here in Eagle Pass, because right now they are blocked from processing migrants there. But Texas, again, is saying that they will not allow Border Patrol in because they believe that processing migrants in that area will incentivize more people to cross into the U.S. illegally.
So I think everyone agrees that there is a problem at the southern border. You've seen it firsthand. You have described this border deal as one of the toughest border and immigration laws in modern history. And it really is. It gives the president a lot of leeway to really sort of shut down the border and send people back if it becomes too much of a problem. How would this bill change the situation on the ground?
Well, Emery, this bill would dramatically change policy here at the U.S. Mexico border. It would, as you just underscored, grant the president the sweeping authority to effectively shut down asylum processing in between ports of entry here at the border when the number of people entering the U.S. illegally reaches a certain level. And that will allow the U.S. Border Patrol to just quickly return migrants back across the Rio Grande here in Texas into Mexico without allowing them to request asylum. Importantly, this bill would preserve asylum processing at the official crossings. These are the ports of entry where there is legal travel and trade. And so that is an important part of this bill. This bill would also allow the asylum seekers who are able to pass these asylum screenings to work in the U.S. immediately, a change that will likely be welcomed by New York City, Chicago, Denver, and other cities across the U.S. that right now are struggling to house migrants who are destitute and who are relying on social services because they can't work in the U.S. legally. So this bill is already garnering criticism from the left that says that this bill is draconian and that it restricts asylum to too much of a degree, and also from the right, from people who are saying that it allows too many asylum seekers still to be processed by the U.S.
Camilo, thank you so much.